Being on stage can be terrifying, and I would know. As a kid, if someone asked me to so much as get onto the stage, I would literally have a meltdown and leave the room. But now, as an adult, I recently performed at the Roundhouse in front of 1,000 people as part of the Roundhouse Poetry Slam final. So the question is, how did I do that? So hello friends, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about the 4 stages or steps that will help you improve not just your confidence and performance in poetry, but honestly overall in your life and your overall well-being as well, because that's what's happened to me through poetry. Let's start at stage 0, which is finding your voice. Before you even get on stage, or even think about writing a poem, or even think about performing, honestly, it's really important to know why you are doing what you're doing. Do you want your poetry, for example, to entertain people and help them find some comic relief in the everyday fumblings of your life? Or maybe you want your poetry to inspire people to take action on an issue that you're passionate about. Or maybe you just want your poetry to make people feel those really hard feelings that maybe we don't talk about on a daily basis. Of course, if you're performing a set of poems, you may have one poem within the set that has all those different purposes, but it's still important to have an overall guiding reason for your performance and your performance journey. From your why, you can basically work backwards to find your voice and start building up an idea of what you want your performances to look like. Because for example, with me, I know that I always want my poetry to entertain people and to be as accessible as possible. So then from there, on stage, I might want to get the audience involved in my performance, use simpler language in my poetry, and make sure that in my set, at least one of the poems are comedic or have a joke in it. I think also as a person of color, sometimes we're not prone to trusting ourselves and trusting our voices. I found that having a guiding force behind my poetry has been extremely helpful, because it helps me trust that actually, no, I'm there for a reason, and therefore I'm also allowed to take up space, which is something that I think as a person of color, you're often told not to do. And that was something that I have struggled a lot with, which is why I'm saying this is the first step. One last point as well before we move on to the next stage, that why I feel I will also really help you connect with your authentic self, which is so important when you're doing poetry. Because yes, when you're on stage, if you want to play a character, if you want to embody someone else on stage, that's all well and good, but all of that still has to come from your authentic self, because that is what people are going to connect with the most. Now we move on to stage 1, which is mindfulness and awareness, and this is going to be split into 2 smaller sections. So let's start with the first one, which is body language. And this is sort of what I was talking about at the beginning of the video as to how poetry can really come into other areas of your life. When you're on stage, your body language along with your words are what's going to signal to the audience what kind of performance they're watching, and therefore how they're meant to react. So for example, if I'm on stage and I'm standing hunched over with my hands in my pockets, maybe not making much eye contact, just looking straight at the crowd, or even just reading off my phone or a piece of paper, which is something that literally everyone, including me, does and or has done. It's probably not the vibes that you want to give when you're on stage, and the audience might just end up sitting there silently and your poem might just end up washing over them. So I'd recommend, before you even get anywhere near a stage, literally stand in your bedroom in front of a mirror and practice focusing on your body movements while you're reading your piece. Focus on the sensations in your body and what feels most natural. So for example, when I'm reading, as you can literally see right now, the thing that feels most natural to me is a lot of hand gestures, making eye contact with the audience, and sometimes just walking back and forth on the stage, sometimes, you know, like a stand-up comedy set. And a great exercise to help with this, if it still feels a little bit awkward, is to try and imagine that you're reading your poem to a friend or a loved one, and you're trying to get your point across as far as possible. What would your body do to help you convey that point? And I'd recommend doing this in front of a mirror, like I said, or even in front of your phone camera. That's something I've done when there's no mirrors, to help you see what the audience is going to see. And yes, it will feel a bit awkward, but that's just what we got to do with poetry, and you got to push through it. Mindfulness on stage. As well as body language, it's really important to consider your emotions on stage, particularly because poetry can be a really emotionally volatile art form, and I think this is something people don't talk about enough. And if you're writing a lot about difficult topics, traumatic topics even, you don't want those emotions when you're on stage to engulf you. You don't want to be drawn back into that trauma. To quote a workshop recently that I was in, run by an amazing poet called Deanna Roger, you're a vessel for the poem, not a vessel for the emotion. And in the workshop, she explained that by saying we don't need to be method actors when we're doing poetry. We don't need to be in that emotion when we're performing. When we are practicing body language and how that emotion from the poem or words from the poem come through, we are also practicing how we portray that emotion. And this is particularly important because I feel like as a performer, something that we also often don't talk about a lot is that you do have a responsibility somewhat to create a safe environment, and it's important that you're able to keep yourself safe first, and then you're able to create a safe environment for the audience afterwards. Now we come to stage 2, which is honing your performance, aka practicing it. So right now you're probably thinking, okay, I know why practicing and rehearsing is important, I get it, we need to create a safe space, I'm feeling confident and ready to go, but Priyanka, how do I practice? And what do I practice? I don't know what I'm doing. So let's start with what. What are you practicing for? Are you practicing for a slam? In which case, you probably want to check the timing regulations and maybe practice 1 or 2 poems depending on how many rounds there are in a slam. Are you practicing for an open mic? In which case, you again might want to check if there are any timing regulations, because sometimes open mics will have a certain allotted time frame for each poet, and maybe practice a couple poems so you have a little bit of range on the night. Normally open mics it's only 1 or 2. Are you practicing for a show or a gig? In which case, again, you might want to check how long your set is and then decide how many poems you want to fit into that time. The next W, why? Why are you practicing? So let's start again from the top. If you're practicing for a slam, the reason why you're practicing is because you want to make sure that obviously you remember your poem, but also because you want to make sure that your poem fits within that time frame. So you might want to use a timer to time yourself while you're practicing. If you're practicing for a show or a gig, you might want to use your practice session to see how one poem flows into another and how your set works together. Maybe performing the set in front of an audience that you trust, like a friend or a loved one, to get their response as well and see that your poems are getting the reactions that you might want on the night. And if you're practicing for an open mic or for yourself, because I feel like those two are usually quite interchangeable, and maybe you want to film yourself performing so you can look at it afterwards and maybe take notes and be like, I didn't like how I was doing that there, or actually I realized when I was performing that poem my hand was on my hip or my hands were in my pockets. And maybe think about ways you might want to switch up your performance, which we'll get onto in a minute. Next is where. Where are you practicing? In front of your mirror, no shame at all. Shout out to Kirsty on Instagram who gave me an amazing tip inadvertently of when you're practicing to use a hairbrush as a microphone substitute. There are other options for practicing though if you are feeling a little bit more adventurous, and I just want to give a quick shout out to the Roundhouse here because they have some amazing practice rooms for poets and artists alike. And there are actually a lot of other venues out there in London and the UK that you can just book and go and practice. But hey, open mics are actually also a great place to practice too. I think they offer a really nice space, maybe ahead of a show or ahead of a slam, to be like, okay, I'm just gonna see what happens when I get up on stage. But also, FaceTime a friend, FaceTime a family member, get their opinion as well, whatever feels most comfortable to you. But don't push yourself, and it's important to remember that no matter what you're doing, no matter what you're practicing, you should really keep joy at the heart of all your performances, because that's what's going to help you through like 3-day practice sessions of doing the same poem over and over again. Stage 3, bringing in the audience. Now so far, this has been a lot about you. But what about the people watching your performance? The one thing that terrifies every performer, regardless of what art form they're practicing in, the audience. But I have a secret to tell you. Come closer. The audience are actually a lot nicer than you think. Remember, when it comes to the audience, literally the only thing that they want to feel is like they're being brought into the performance. And the best way you can do that is by returning to your intention. If you know why you're on that stage, you're going to be able to bring the audience in a way that feels right to you. Like if we go back to my example at the very first stage, my intention is always to entertain the audience. So my way of bringing in the audience might be to ask them to do a little line of a poem with me, or even just, you know, that I've done a lot before, is reminding people that, hey, you know what, this is a safe space and you're allowed to respond verbally with like a hell yeah or a woohoo or like clap and make noise, you know, like that's the kind of response that I want as a performer. Oftentimes poets will do this by giving trigger warnings at the start of their performances as well, which I do think is something that everyone should consider. The most important thing to remember though as a poet is that it's never like you versus them with the audience. You have the power to control the audience by going on stage and setting the rules, whether that's coming onto the stage and being like, I just want you to watch my performance, I'm not even going to think about your response, or coming in and being like, hey guys, my name is Priyanka, da 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 da. It is all up to you, my friend. You set the rules. And now we come to the final stage, which is stage 4, being creative. The main thing to remember about poetry, and one of the reasons why I love it so much, is there is so much room for creativity and expression. I remember once I was at a workshop at the Roundhouse led by Toby Campion, another great poet that everyone should look up. And he said at a slam that someone did sit-ups on stage while performing a poem about toxic masculinity. And I was like, holy shit, that is amazing. But also, I'm not exercising on stage. The point is, once you've gotten to a point where you're like, actually, I sort of know what I'm doing on stage, or even I'm just here on stage to play, that is the perfect time for you to just go in, jump for it, test stuff out. For example, when I was preparing for my performance at the Roundhouse Slam, I was really inspired to actually switch up my movements. I had a poem that I wrote in 2019, so I had been performing it for a while, but I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna try and add in a bunch of different movements, and it actually made it a lot more fun to perform and really injected like this new sort of energy into my piece. And another cool way that you can be creative with your performance and with your poetry is that, come here, you don't actually have to read your full poem. I know, what the fuck? To quote a poetry workshop by another great poet, Yomi Shode, who is over here, he said, think of your performance like an artist mixing their song on stage with another track. So what that means is, when you're reading your poem, you can start at the top, maybe read the first few lines, go to the bottom, come back to the middle. Maybe you start in the middle, you go to the bottom, and you end it. Maybe you go to the middle, you go to the top, go to the middle, go to the top again, go to the bottom, end it. And when I got told this, I was like, whoa, why haven't I thought of doing that before? Whatever it is that you're doing on stage, remember that you make the rules, okay? It's all up to you. And as long as you're keeping yourself safe and you're keeping joy at the heart of all your performances, you're having a good time, you're playing around with it, then you're literally gonna end up performing like a pro. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you did, please leave a little comment below. Tell me where you're at in your poetry journey. If you are still a beginner poet, I think you will like this video here where I talk about 10 things I wish I knew when I started my poetry journey. And yeah, let's chat in the comments about poetry. Actually, comment your favorite poet below, because this comment section is gonna be me being like, no, I'm joking. And as always, I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you over there in the next video.